Major funding for this program was provided by Jefferson Smurfit Corporation. Around the world, we're known for our paper, paperboard and packaging products, and paper recycling. We are proud of our Irish heritage through our association with Jefferson Smurfit Group.
Funding for this program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
I was taken to my first parade when I was about 6. I remember standing on Fifth Avenue with my father, watching the parade, literally being taken into the folds of his coat. And there was this unspoken sense of this is a celebration of what we've come from, where we are and where we're going.
Once this was a totally Irish parade. Now it's become a Catholic festival, which brings in all ethnic groups. But that too, in a way, recapitulates the role that the Irish played in this country.
The Irish in America broke the ground for a lot of succeeding generations of nationalities, and they made it a little easier for them to come in and assimilate. We were the first wave over. They were just thrown over here, and they were really on their own.
It makes me proud to be part of the Irish because they did some good things. They also did some very terrible things. There's a great statement by one of the first of the Irish Catholics in this country, Charles Carroll, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was talking about the wrongs the Irish suffered. He said, "We must remember and forgive." And I think that's true of the modern Irish. We should remember it because it's so important, but we should forgive ourselves and forgive others for some of the mistakes that were made and the misdeeds that were done.
se le scéal nóú sean scéal ige sinúidir se gan an scéal. Agus más fearr tá sé agam san nó go mo seap.
The Irish are old hands at telling stories. They like talk. They're word hungry. Their oldest stories in Gaelic can take days in the telling.
No dás dar agus fuidir siar na gal. Goes back 2,000 years. Some of the words that I've said, relating as far back as that. From father to son, and from father to son, and his other son back again, and the generations one after the other. That's how it came down. The storytelling.
In every townland, there was some great storyteller. And he didn't tell the truth. In most cases, he never told the truth. But he would look forward to coming into the house that night, because he always had these yarns and stories. Because from the month of October, they sat at night in semi-darkness. And there was no other way of amusing themselves, only to tell stories. It was fun. Of course it was fun. That was all the fun you knew.
Ireland's first storytellers were poets, attached to the courts of the Gaelic chieftains. They were the keepers of history.
The poet, of course, was a figure of great authority. And when people came into the great hall to hear a new poem, whether it was a praise poem of his lord, or whether it was some excoriating satire of the lord's enemy, these were important occasions, and a kind of a light glowed around the poet.
This was the Gaelic aristocracy at its finest hour, before the disasters of the 17th century, when the British broke the power of the Catholic chieftains, took possession of their lands, sacked their castles, banned their faith. The turning point was Hugh O'Neill, warrior chieftain, pride of poets, the second Earl of Tyrone. He gathered up Irish forces and tried to drive Queen Elizabeth's troops into the sea. When he failed and fled to Rome, he brought down the old Gaelic order.
What I heard about him was that he was a great warrior, a great leader, and a wonderful fighter. It's the start of the history. It's the start of the history. It's the start of the turmoil in Ireland.
The poets, in their stories and songs, turned from celebrations of princes and courts to tales of defeat, flight, exile. Like the Jews of the Old Testament, the Irish cast themselves as a wandering, despised people. But one day, the songs promised, their pride would be restored. The year of O'Neill's flight was 1607, the year of the founding of Jamestown in Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in North America. The Irish began to cross the Atlantic not long after, drawn by the promise of land. They were few in number. They traveled on cargo ships, many of them Catholics, indentured servants, rootless young men who would do 5 years unpaid labor in exchange for their fare. Often the sea captain, landing in the ports of New York or Philadelphia, would auction them off like goods to the highest bidder. Later, these same ports were clogged with strange men, women and children, speaking English with a foreign lilt. They were tall, lean, with hard faces. Americans complained their manner was full of pride. They were the first to come from Ireland in great numbers, Protestants from the north.
The first wave of Irish immigration is one that most Americans aren't even aware of. We all think of the famine Irish, the 1840s as the point when the Irish really came pouring into America. But before the American Revolution, thousands of Irish came pouring into this country. And it so happened that the back country of the American colonies was opening up. People were going out there, and they were looking for a tough bunch of fighters who could protect them against the Indian tribes who were all on the border of the colonies. So these people were perfect because they had been fighting either with each other or with the Catholics. for generations.
They cut down the hardwood forests to plow between the rotting stumps. They built their log cabins and their churches. Their Irish melodies were turned into American hymns. They hunted deer and wild turkey. They hunted the Indian. They were marksmen, sharpshooters, frontiersmen. They were the first Irish to capture the American imagination.
They had this tradition of fighting. So they volunteered to fight in the American Revolutionary Army by the thousands. And in the Pennsylvania, each of the colonies had what they called a line, the Continental Line. That was the 3 or 4 or 5 regiments that they were required to supply to Washington's army. And in Pennsylvania, the Continental Line was known as the Line of Ireland, because 4/5 of the people in it were Irish.
After the Revolution, these tough Presbyterians moved through the Cumberland Gap into the new frontier of Kentucky and Tennessee. In 1815, they massed at New Orleans to defend the Mississippi Valley from the invading British. This battle produced a great hero, General Andrew Jackson of the Tennessee frontier. In constant pain from a bullet lodged in his ribs, Jackson was ferocious to his enemies, ferociously loyal to his friends. He was the first man to run a popular Democratic campaign for the White House, and the first man of Irish descent to be elected president. The booming transatlantic trade tied the fortunes of Ireland with the fortunes of America. Spanish treasure ships traveling homeward from the New World brought Europe a new root vegetable, first grown by Indians on the hillsides of the Andes. What the Indians called papa, the Spanish patata, became known everywhere as the Irish potato. It shaped Ireland's history, and America's as well.
Now, during the famine, we were told that the people just did this. They cut out the bare eye and they saw them. And they claimed they grew because they wanted to eat the rest of the potato. And they couldn't afford to put it in the soil, they wanted it for food. So rather than putting in the whole potato, they cut out the eyes and sowed the eyes in the ground.
In the depths of the great famine in Ireland, a British official would write, "The wretched people seem to be human potatoes, a sort of emanation from the root. They have lived by the potato and will die with it."
Shen truyer nach mische, shen truyer nach mische ban fodin. Shen truyer nach mische, san vanata agave koilte. Raka gagalya, raka le podin. Raka gagalya, is choke the wireless and modlish. Shen truyer nach mische, shen truyer nach mische ban fodin.
The Irish poor, before the Great Famine, built a world for themselves filled with joy and danger. A happy-go-lucky life, nourished by a single, unreliable root. More than 3 million Irish ate no food except the potato. Healthy, handsome, they were one of the poorest people in the Christian world. They were known as the potato people.
Well, they had 3 meals a day. There was potatoes for breakfast, potatoes for lunch, potatoes for dinner. They boiled the potatoes in a huge pot on the peat fire. They emptied it into a basket in the middle of the floor to steam it. Then the whole family gathered around and ate the meal from the basket. And if they had chickens or dogs or anything else, they got their share as well, because everyone was on the same diet.
They first turned to the potato as a hedge against the hunger that came when their oats and wheat failed. But the potato was nutritious and thrived in the wet soil of Ireland. In time, it took over the fields of the poor. They married young, raised potatoes and large families. On hard-scrabble land, they divided and subdivided. In the 100 years before the famine, Ireland's population tripled. In search of land, the poor pushed up into the barren mountains and bogs in the west.
Well, prior to the famine, this whole area would have been one series of potato fields. It would have been full of people, full of children. There could possibly have as many as 15 or 20 cabins, each with 7 children. They had a lively, they loved living together, the Irish, at this time. They were never lonely. If you can imagine maybe 50 to 100 kids running around these mountains, people from the outside might have thought they were desperately poor, desperately uncivilized. But they cared for one another, and they were happy enough as long as the potato held out.
They lived the life of the seasons. On St. Bridget's Day, February 1st, they prepared their ground for planting. On St. Patrick's Day, they planted. On Midsummer's Eve, they built bonfires on the hills, danced and sang, singed the cattle with burning coals, a ritual from the ancient Celtic past. By Halloween, the harvest was in, the days were short, and the nights were given over to talk.
And the weight of the night was taken up with ghost stories. There was ghosts at every stile and every gate. All the people would be in thrall listening and afraid to go home. The dark. Yeah, afraid to go home.
The great storyteller went on to delight and frighten and terrify and charm his audience by inventing a whole series of stories, some of them cleverly interweaving characters from the local village, because the children had to be satisfied and old people had to compare the prowess of this storyteller. Was he as good as his father? Or was she, did she have the kind of qualities of being able to break into song that her mother had?
They lived in clusters, sharing their cabins with pigs and cattle. 10 or 12 people in a single room. In the hungry months of July and August, when the old potatoes were rotten and the new not yet ready, men from the west left to work in foreign harvest fields, while their families went begging on the roads.
The bulk of the population working the land was barefoot every day of the year, and certainly of children. This is true of children. Their clothing, the word rags, is always used to describe the way they are dressed. Some people describing it at the time say they are rags tied together to cover the body.
To the despair of their improving landlords, they lived the ancient customs of a communal life. For all their hard work, they had no use for the ambitious or the acquisitive. Share and share alike was the rule. To those who broke the rule, they gave the sharp edge of their tongues. They mourned their dead neighbors at raucous wakes, a mix of Catholic and pagan. There were prayers and erotic charades, whiskey and ancient lamentations.
They enjoyed a funeral. It went on for 3 days. They could find the porter and the whiskey. They could invite in the best keening women. It's a woman's way of lamenting, and it has a blood-curdling effect. And there were people telling jokes, of course. It's a way of unburdening the community of some sorrow. And it's also a way of bringing that community together. After all, they lived very close to each other.
Every spring and autumn they flocked to the country fairs. Tinkers came with their pots and pans, beggars, fiddlers, gamblers, matchmakers. The first order of business was buying and selling, but then came sports, bear baiting, horse racing, and public brawls, in which joy mingled with blood and broken heads.
Disputes about land and cattle trespassing in other people's land, and they'd all go to the fair with a walking stick, and the fight would start in some pub at the fair. That's how it would be. If you was after some man, you'd get him at the fair with a stick.
All scores had to be settled by faction fighting between feuding families that went back over years. Took each other on fighting with ash plants and things like that, which they used for driving the stock to fairs. And they used them on each other. And whoever could fight the best won the day.
In the years before the famine, British travelers moved through Ireland, watching the lives of the potato people, fascinated and appalled. The British came across the narrow Irish Sea from the richest and most modern economy on earth to a people who were their neighbors within the United Kingdom, yet who seemed as exotic and as idle as South Sea Islanders. British reformers, Protestant, industrious, zealous for improvement, studied and restudied the Irish problem. Their task, they concluded, was to transform Ireland, not just its economy, but its moral character. Famine would give them their opportunity. After Andrew Jackson defeated the British in 1815, peace settled onto the New World, and Americans turned to the immense task of binding their empire together. They had to carve through mountain and forests to connect the Atlantic seaboard to the Great Lakes, and the Great Lakes to the Ohio and Mississippi. America's expansion in these years rested on the canal, and the building of the canal rested on the shoulders of Irishmen. The Erie Canal called for a ditch 40 feet wide, cut out of 350 miles of rock and swamp. It needed labor. Handbills appeared on the streets of Dublin and Belfast. Come to a land of promise, where there's meat eaten at every meal, and tea twice a day.
My great-grandfather was from a very poor family. They were able to sell a pig, and they used the money for his passage. He landed in New York, and he heard on the street that they were hiring for the Erie Canal. And he figured he was a strong young man. He was about 16 or 17 at the time. And so he went to work on the Erie Canal.
It was the next great wave of Irish immigration. Weavers and spinners pushed out of their trades by machines. Farmers and farm laborers fleeing an agricultural depression. Even middle-class lawyers and doctors, ambitious, all of them, to improve their lot. Close to 1 million came over. Most were Catholics. The young and able-bodied, those whose only resource was muscle, found work on the canals.
They become an industrial army in the United States. They become the army that's going to dig the canals and do all this work of erecting the basic infrastructure of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. They're at the lowest level of this rude physical labor. That's why they're valued, and that's what they find. And they go from these rural villages in Ireland that are very cohesive, and all of a sudden they're on this high-speed industrializing economy in the United States. I think they're pretty disoriented from this whole transfer.
The Irishmen were down in the ditch. They dug with picks and shovels. Oxen pulled the stumps, moved the boulders. Mules in single file carted the dirt out of the ditch and piled it on the canal side. At the rate of 40 miles a year, this industrial army moved across old Iroquois country. They leveled mountains, filled in swamps, bridged rivers. In the Cayuga swamps near Syracuse, they worked in water thigh-deep, with burning garlands around their necks to protect against malarial mosquitoes.
And of course there was a lot of drinking because the saloon people or the grog shops would follow both the canal diggers and then later on the railroad gangs would be followed by gamblers and grog house people. So a lot of times these people just drank the money away.
I mean, they would work 14, 16-hour days and then drink and fight. I mean, fighting was a way of, this was a kind of macho society that you would have the hard drinking, the hard working, and the hard fighting. And it was not just for turf, it was just for recreation.
They lived like young soldiers in rough camps. Proud, boastful, they turned their hard and dangerous work into contests of strength and daring, created new heroes, warriors of the pick and shovel. They raced horses, fought faction fights. Men from Cork fought bloody brawls with men from Connaught for job rights on the canal. Sometimes they joined forces and turned on their bosses.
And they weren't paid, sometimes for months. Well, this caused great resentment on the laborer's part. He could only appeal to the contractor. And if the contractor didn't have money, which very often he didn't, then the worker was out of luck. And there was nothing he could do except fight back.
Hundreds of Irish workers on the Chesapeake and Ohio were blasting a 3,000-foot tunnel deep below the peak of Paw Paw Mountain when the company's collapse swallowed up their wages. The C&O, whose grandiose plans rivaled those of the Faroes, now had to deal with the fury of their workers. They ransacked company stores, seized 140 kegs of gunpowder, and threatened to blow up the locks unless they were paid every penny that was owed them. We put it together, they warned. We can take it apart. The Canal Irish built more than they knew, more than locks and tunnels. When they were pushed and they pushed back, they began the work of blunting the hard, cold edge of American industry. But as these uprooted young men dug their way westward, their violence terrified Americans in town after town. Their strikes dissolved into riots. They tore through rival work camps, bludgeoning Germans and Swedes. In state after state, the militia were called out to deal with the Irish.
The tensions began to emerge between the Yankees and the Irish in 1830s to 1840s. By that time, there were a lot of Irish coming into this country. There were really over 1 million immigrants to this country, say, between 1800 and the famine years of the 1840s.
The Irish were numerous, turbulent, and worse, they were Catholic. Slavish followers of the Pope, it was said. Subverters of the Republic. The haters of the Pope found a public enemy in Archbishop John Hughes.
One of these people who comes over in this first wave of Irish laborers is a man, John Hughes, from the north of Ireland. He comes over as a laborer. He works on roads in Pennsylvania. And then he wheedles his way into the seminary at St. Mary's in Maryland and becomes a Catholic priest and winds up as the Archbishop of New York. And he's half this kind of spalpeen laborer and the other half a tribal leader of the Irish. The Irish at this time, this is pre-Tammany, they don't have political leaders. But in John Hughes, they have a political leader. He was known to the nativists as Dagger John because Catholic archbishops put a cross before their name. Well, one of the nativist clergymen saw this cross and thought it was a dagger and saw all his proclamations signed with this, and this was if he was going to stab the Protestant America, overthrow this society that existed, take away the democratic rights of people, and impose Rome rule on the United States.
Like the canal workers, Bishop Hughes was a fighter. Unlike them, he was sure of his ground. He was confident that the future of America lay with Catholicism. And he touched off a storm when he demanded that Catholics get their share of public school money. The controversy over the schools soon turned violent. Bloody riots swept through Philadelphia in 1844, when Irish mobs clashed with mobs of Protestants.
All hell broke loose. all of these tough young American Protestants started smashing up houses, tearing them down, beating up every Irish person they could find, burning down houses. And the next thing you know, there was flames boiling up everywhere. Some of the Irish retreated to a church. They charged in there, drove them out, burned down the church. And then these riots continued for 3 days.
They were some of the worst riots America had seen. 2 Catholic churches and hundreds of Irish houses burned to the ground. But the Catholics gave as good as they got. Of the 20 killed, only 1 was of their kind. When news of the first riots reached New York, Bishop Hughes deployed thousands of armed Irishmen to protect his churches. Then he paid a call on the mayor.
And he goes to see the mayor, and the mayor is very solicitous and says, "Your Eminence, are you worried that there'll be some of your churches will be burned down?" And Hughes says, "No, I'm worried some of your churches will be burned down." And in a phrase that will ring in the mind of the upper classes in New York, he says to the mayor, "If one Catholic church is touched, the Irish will turn New York into a second Moscow." This is 30 years after the Russians burned Moscow to prevent the French from getting it, so it's a very real threat, and it's taken as that.
He was posting Irish Catholic guards around Catholic churches in the city, and if one Catholic church was touched, Irish Catholics were going to burn the city down. They were going to turn it into another Moscow, he said, and no Catholic church was touched.
And this is right on the eve of the famine. This is 1844. What's going to develop later is very clear. It becomes clear in the career of John Hughes. It's clear in the nativist riots in Boston and in Philly before the famine that the Irish are not going to make a very peaceful, calm entry into the United States. This is not a group of people who are coming into the country who fit in. They don't fit in, which is the beginning of a new chapter in American history.
The first sign of the Great Blight that hit around the 1st of August could get a stench, a smell off the potato stalk before it turned black. And a fog came down that was seen from Bantry Bay unto the Ox Mountains in County Sligo. And the blight was universal, and despair set in on the sight of it.
They would go to bed at night and everything was fine. They'd come out in the morning and there was this horrible smell all over the area and the plants were blackened.
They were dumbfounded. They stood in disbelief looking at the fields turning black, knowing that their livelihood was gone.
There was nothing inevitable about the Great Famine. Nothing in the potato people's way of life that could only be remedied by the deaths of 1 million and the emigration of 1.5 million more. The famine was a piece of bad luck, a natural disaster whose horrors were multiplied by the arrogance of man. The peasants, bewildered, asked themselves, what was this blight? Where did it come from? Was it static electricity from the new trains that crisscrossed the Irish countryside? Were there vapors leaking from inside the earth? Or was it the will of God, punishment because they'd sinned? They didn't know it then, but the blight came from America in the form of a fungus, Phytophthora infestans. It moved across the Atlantic in the holds of ships and floated on winds through the lowlands and southern England before landing not far from Dublin. the fungus that wafted across the fields of the potato people would bring their world to an end. They would flee Ireland and strive to reinvent on the streets of America the world they left behind. In 1845, the first year of the Great Famine, the estate of Strokestown in County Roscommon, where some 10,000 poor lived and worked, passed into the hands of Dennis Mahon. He did not hold the title long. He moved to clear the peasants off his land and ship them to new lives across the Atlantic. 2 years later, he would be dead, killed by an assassin's bullet. The story of this landlord's life and death reveals the forces that transformed Ireland and set in motion one of the great migrations of human history.
You get to Strokestown, you see this enormous vista, and at the end of it is this Strokestown house, which could be called a castle. And you were drawn into it like a magnet. What was extraordinary to me about the house was this series of tunnels through which the servants scuttled so that the family did not have to see them. It was almost as if they were carriers of some contagion. So there's no visible contact between the servants and the Mahon family. And in the kitchen, there was this elevated structure over the kitchen in which the menus were dropped down at the beginning of the week. And so the mistress of the house did not have to have any contact with the serving staff in the kitchen, the cooks.
The Mahons, like other landlords, were descendants of the conquerors of Ireland, inheritors of lands taken from the old Gaelic order after the fall of Hugh O'Neill. They were neither English nor Irish. A marginal people, they moved often uneasily between London's social whirl and the impoverished Irish countryside.
Elaborate gates and elaborate exotic plants and deer parks. So it has pretensions to being part of the cosmopolitan European world at the height of its power. And the meaning of these houses becomes clearer when you look inside the houses. A kind of shoddy, worn-out appearance of some broken windows, unmended, things like that. That identifies it as being the Irish gentry. The house and the grounds still had magnificence, but in the books, in the account books, it was shoddy, it was overrun with debt.
Major Dennis Mahon, forward-looking and ambitious, was sinking under generations of debt. His account books told the story of tenants who repeatedly, gale day after gale day, failed to appear with their rents. Times were bad, they said. They couldn't pay. Truth was, the Major was not in charge. Outside of the big house with its unseen servants, there were layers upon layers of tenants and subtenants who siphoned off his rents. Good sense called for a shift from growing potatoes and grain to pasturing sheep and cattle. But in the way were the tangle of tenants, and at the bottom, thousands of poor on their tiny plots.
In the period before the famine, and indeed into the early years of the famine, the biggest obstacle to evictions and clearing of land is peasant resistance, particularly in the central parts of Ireland. Peasant secret societies have existed for a long period of time. That they try to keep down rents, they try to keep down taxation to make sure that land is available for peasants to grow potatoes. And if a landlord tries to carry out a mass eviction, they will resist that by force.
By 1844, Dennis Mahon and others of his class in the neighborhood are well aware that there is a threat to them personally that they probably didn't feel 10 years before.
They were drawn from the most desperate of the poor, men who burned and killed to defend themselves against a world of change. Even in their violence, they lived the life of custom. They took secret oaths that bound them to gangs with names like White Boys, Threshers, Ribbon Men. Ambitious farmers, middlemen, and agents would receive in the mail a crudely drawn coffin signed Captain Rock, or perhaps, Molly Maguire.
The White Boys of Chalala, that was one secret society. There was a bailiff, the poor devil, up there at Tiernar, and they threw him into a big drain and covered him with wires and briars, bare naked. And they cut out 2 ears off with a shears for shearing sheep. That's what they done to that man, and he was found dead. Because he was collecting the rent for the landlords and helping the landlords to evict tenants and all that, like. There were a lot of them cases then.
Against Irish lawlessness, there were the forces of the Crown, troops and barracks throughout Ireland, and the Irish police. It was the police who reported widespread blight in September 1845. They reported to London that half the potato crop had been destroyed. The British had seen many partial crop failures in Ireland. For reformers, now was the time to prepare the ground for fundamental change. So this would be the last of the Irish famines. Such was the ambition of Charles Trevelyan, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, the man who took charge of British relief.
Charles Trevelyan is a deeply religious man. He is also a workaholic, an obsessive workaholic who very rarely leaves his desk. When he becomes the most senior civil servant in the British Treasury, he immediately sets about turning the Treasury into the most important department in the government. Nothing happens in the British administration without his say-so.
He was earnest, idealistic, dedicated to self-improvement and the improvement of others. And he hated idleness, whether in the fox-hunting gentry of England or the potato people of Ireland. He reckoned that their labor, planting, harvesting, digging turf for their fires, amounted to no more than a few weeks out of the year. Too much idle time to do the devil's work. Trevelyan detected the devil's work in the policies adopted in the famine's first year. The government had reacted promptly, imported boatloads of Indian corn from America, established public relief works. Such programs, he was sure, would promote waste, fraud, dependency. In fact, they were a success. The Irish shared, they ate the Indian corn, they got by. In spring 1846, at the close of the famine's first year, Strokestown police found a poor man in a ditch on the side of the road. The first death they reported due to starvation. But British officials were confident that the famine was contained. This, after all, was a desperately poor country. It is always this way, wrote one landowner, at this time of year. We know little about the individual lives of those who died during the famine. In County Mayo, in the far west of Ireland, 1 out of every 3 people would disappear. Most often, there are no birth or death records, no gravestones, no family portraits to remember them by. The survivors were themselves silent, reluctant to talk.
My grandfather came from Mayo. He never talked about it. He just came. For him, for me, I mean, I sort of saw him as coming out of a blank past. One can only guess from his silence that there was a history of horror there.
At harvest time in 1846, when the poor went out into their fields, they once again found their plants blackened with rot, once again filled with the stench of death. But in the famine's second year, the crop failure was near total. The potatoes were gone. The tenants on the estate at Westport in County Mayo knew that without help they were lost. They marched to the big house in solemn procession, 4 abreast, 3,000 strong. And when the youthful Lord Sligo emerged from the front hall, they knelt before him in supplication. The story of Lord Sligo and his choices is the story of the west of Ireland. Like Dennis Mahon, he took over his estate in the first year of the famine. This sorrowful old man, whose portrait hangs in Westport House, was once the young idealist who stood before his kneeling tenants and promised he would stand by them. Several years would pass before he and his tenants would know the awful cost of that promise.
He was my great-grandfather. His name was George John. He inherited at a very early age, in fact, at about 23. And being a family as we were, and we say this with great pride, we weren't the kind of family that just would leave or go or just try and shift out of the situation. I mean, to us again, and with him, this was a situation to try and face up to, in fact. And this, I think, he tried the best of his ability.
Lord Sligo and his family before him took pride in their reputation as enlightened landlords. His ancestors had built that house, built a graceful town around it. The tenants' ancestors had served the family for 200 years. Despite their angers, time and memory bound the tenants in loyalty to the big house. And after the second crop failure, Lord Sligo returned that loyalty. Disregarding his own safety, he passed out guns to his tenants, so the hungry could live off his game preserves. He went into debt to charter the sailing ship Martha Washington and brought 1,000 tons of cornmeal from New Orleans to the wharves at Westport. And he made Westport House itself a soup kitchen. His tenants scavenged the fields for half-rotted roots. They ate next year's seed potatoes. They took to the roads.
Once the very, very bad year of the famine came in, people poured into Westport because Westport was at least a center. But all everyone found when they poured in was really that everybody else was in much the same situation, in fact. People were trying to eat any cattle that were left. They were trying to eat any sheep were left. There were stories of people actually fighting for dogs and cats in order to try and get food to eat.
The town of Westport, its elegant streets filled to bursting with the desperate and the hungry, looked out over the rich fishing grounds of the Atlantic. Great schools of fish were theirs for the taking, but here custom was the people's undoing. They hadn't built boats large enough for the open Atlantic, never looked upon fish as anything more than a supplement to the potato. When the potato failed, many of them sold or pawned their nets to purchase food.
By this time, they were desperate. They harvested edible seaweed and boiled it, and they stripped the rocks and the seashore of all living matter, all shellfish, until there was no edible seaweed and no shellfish left. In the end, they were reduced to eating grass. Some visitors noted the green mouths of the children and the people. They were reduced to that in the end.
The starving passed from an angry and frenzied search for food to a profound apathy, a strange state of indifference. The daily work of scavenging, cooking, and cleaning were abandoned. Conversation ceased. Women turned away from their children. Starvation aged the young, made children into old men and women. Visitors' accounts describe them as too weak to cry, their skin as thin as muslin, the hair on their heads falling out. Prolonged starvation dragged down the mouth and cheek and signaled that death was near. Death is the subject of a lament written by a small tenant farmer called Pat Callanan. In 1846, surrounded by the dead and dying, the farmer composed a classical Gaelic lament, a keen. He mourned the deaths of his neighbors by mourning the death of the potato.
Se moje liv
1,000 farewells to the white potatoes. Alas, that they should depart from us now. Such company they were, such cause for dancing. We had sport with them while we were allowed. 1846 is the year, and not without reason. Shall it be remembered until the end of time? Scarcity, poverty, mouths without feeding. There never has been so desperate a scourge. What will buy a shroud for those to be buried? Tobacco, pipes, or a coffin of wood? May the good Lord protect us if we were to die now. And of course, it would be a relief if we could.
A blizzard came, snow and wind, the lot. It lasted for 7 weeks, day and night.
That winter was the worst in living memory. Snow lay on the ground for months, which is unheard of in Ireland.
With the huge consecutive snowdrifts, blizzards that came in here, little glens and valleys like that would be buried under 15, 20 feet of snow, and the habitations would vanish, and what had been a shelter became, in fact, a death trap for those inside those cabins.
They thought the old country was cursed altogether because there was no life for anybody in it. Oh, the weather was awful bad.
As snow covered the fields of Ireland at the close of 1846, British leaders gathered in London to argue the Irish question. These righteous men believed that a free economy expressed the will of God. To interfere was to encourage evil. The strongest voice was Trevelyan's. Whatever the financial cost, he argued, the Irish must be saved from starvation, but not at the moral cost of creating a nation of beggars.
Trevelyan he's got his hand on the purse strings. And, you know, if you feed Irish beggars today, if this relief effort goes on and the British people become responsible for feeding Irish beggars, well, we have 2 beggars today. 3 years from now, we'll have 6.
To earn the money to buy food, flour, corn, oats, the poor were set to work on road building. This was the time-honored way. By these public works, Trevelyan hoped to turn Irish peasants into wage earners, prepare them to be full participants in a modern economy. He goaded his army of overseers, personally reviewed and approved each project. By January of 1847, 700,000 people were working on the roads.
The labourers would have sat on flat stones like we have here and would have smashed larger stones into smaller stones with hammers. And that stone would have been dragged in baskets by other gangs of workers to surface the road, which we can see down there in the valley. You can imagine gangs of starving people, barely able to drag themselves from place to place, carrying loads of stone in the cold, on treacherous footing down there to the surface of the road.
Laborers were to be paid by piecework, so much pay for so many stones broken or hauled. This system broke down immediately. Work gangs threatened the overseers with violence. Families and factions fought for places on the relief rolls. Corrupt relief committees played favorites. The lucky who got relief earned enough to feed their families once a day. Laborers fainted on the sites. Children went hungry to keep their parents fed.
Even people who are working as hard as they can and getting weaker and weaker through malnutrition find it impossible to earn enough to feed their families. So the government offers, when the weather conditions are impossible, half a day's wages for no work. But the people say, we can't live on a full day's wages, never mind half a day's wages, we'll come to work anyway. So you have people working in the most appalling conditions, men, women and children, along the roads, doing pointless work. And increasingly, as you move into December 1846, January 1847, you have large numbers of people dying on the sides of the roads, dying on the public works.
Some of them used to fall dead on the road with the gravel on their backs. And then the foreman made them do so many yards a day. Well, they weren't even fit to do that. In sleet and snow and everything. And their bare feet, of course, they had no footwear them days. A lot of them were found dead on the hills with no footwear. A few old rags and a skull is all you'd find.
By the end of winter, the results were clear. The roadworks were costing lives and money. The government called an end to them. But Trevelyan was not discouraged. He still held to the dream of bringing the Irish into the modern world of work. He himself worked more than ever, stayed at his desk till 2 or 3 a.m. He drew strength from his faith that the famine was the work of an all-wise and all-merciful God, a faith widely shared by reformers within the government. Their influence was growing.
The famine is seen by these people as a blessing. They are convinced that a greater good will come from this evil. And with the sweeping away of this potato system, Ireland will be transformed. You will have an end to poverty, an end to agrarian violence, to agrarian secret societies, an end to hostility between landlord and tenant. You will have nothing but progress in the wake of this great transformation of Irish society. It will solve the Irish question.
January 9th, 1847, gave tickets to the poor. Mrs. Porter died about noon. January 10th, Sabbath, Jack Ward died. January 11th, attended Mrs. Porter's funeral.
Poor Toby Peyton died of fever. He has left 13 children. The MacDermot Roe is dead. He is much regretted. He also died of fever. The poor are dying in hundreds. There is not a day in which we do not hear of the departure of someone whose face at least we knew.
Most of the Irish who died in the famine died of disease, not hunger. Disease traveled with beggars from town to town and with clergymen and doctors as they moved from the cabins of the poor to the homes of the well-off. By 1847, hunger and disease were partners in the mass production of death.
Fevers like typhus and relapsing fever, and dysentery is a big killer during the famine. And wasting diseases like famine dropsy are also major killers. Combine those and you've got an absolute health nightmare. And that's what's happening in Ireland in the period of the famine.
Doctors knew very little about these fevers. They did not know how to cure them, nor even how they were spread. The poor knew that somehow the sick could make you sick. These sociable people isolated the feverish, pushed them into makeshift cells, hastily thrown up against a ditch or a wall. The dying closed their doors.
There'd be only a few relatives, maybe a father and a mother who had a child's funeral, and a sister.
The shattered Irish abandoned the wake, the ceremony that beyond all others bound them together in communion with the living and the dead.
You'd have to leave that funeral as fast as you could, because the black fever, it was raging then. It was so contagious. They'd leave the graveyard as fast as they could in case another funeral had land up. People didn't want to mix with each other then. There was 4 people dead in one house back there in Duwak with the black fever. Nobody came near them. They were there for weeks till the snow was gone.
Spring finally came in 1847 and brought along with it a brief flowering of hope. For one short season, from May until the harvests, the British government did what no state had done before. It took responsibility for feeding millions of its people.
It's on a vast scale. It demonstrates just what the early Victorian state is capable of. The number of deaths collapses during that summer.
Alexis Soyer, the flamboyant chef of London's Reform Club, came to Dublin to publicize soup. Noble lords and ladies came to fashionable Phoenix Park to sample his recipes and declare them excellent. Soon there were soup kitchens across the country. 1 million people, pots and relief tickets in hand, crowded into long lines to receive stirabout, a thick porridge of Indian corn and rice. By midsummer, in a country of 8 million, the state was feeding 3 million every day. Trevelyan's workers had done the impossible, a labor of love, he called it. The third harvest of the famine brought in a healthy crop. The fungus was gone. But too few potatoes had been planted. The yield was enough to feed only a fifth of Ireland's people. Trevelyan wasn't disturbed. In fact, he was pleased. Grains were now cheap, and the people could make the shift to new foods, a new way of life. Trevelyan went off to France to rest and write an account of his stewardship. The soup kitchens were shut down on schedule. The brief season of hope was over. Time again for tears. As news of the harvest was circulating in Ireland, a small vessel, the Virginius, docked in the St. Lawrence River near Quebec. It left Ireland with almost 500 passengers, but at the end of its journey, less than a dozen were strong enough to walk down the gangway. More than 150 had died on board. The rest were quarantined in fever sheds, hollow-eyed skeletons. Their passage had been paid by Major Dennis Mahon, landlord of Strokestown, who had sent his tenants off as the best way out of his troubles. His long campaign to collect rents had come to little. His agent, John Ross Mahon, had written to him laying out the facts. If you want your land to be profitable, most of your tenants must be cleared off. The agent's arithmetic was simple. It cost £7 3 shillings to keep a pauper for a year in the workhouse. It cost less than half that to ship him abroad.
And so Ross Mahon advises his cousin in the straits that the estate is in at this time, that something like 2/3 of the entire tenantry, thousands and thousands of people, will have to go. There's no other way for him to recover the estate. And the correspondence between Ross Mahon and Dennis Mahon suggests that Ross Mahon is twisting his arm, that this is the way you must do it. It's the modern way. But he seems to be backed into a corner.
For months, Mahon hesitated, balked at his agent's plan. It would be immensely costly. He also knew that it could be dangerous, could rekindle all the old animosities of the region. But it seemed that hunger had taken the fight out of the terrorist societies. Mahon wrote back to his agent, begin the evictions. Send them to America. What are the cheapest routes? His agent wrote back, New York, Boston, or Philadelphia, £4. New Orleans, £3.10. The cheapest was Quebec, £3, 3 shillings. Half price for children. They were the poorest of his tenants. Many were sick. At Strokestown, in the end of May, they climbed aboard the horse-drawn carts that would carry them to the dockside at Sligo. They brought with them their bedding and rations and whatever else they possessed. In their rags and memories, they were on their reluctant way from past to future. In between lay the Atlantic.
The passage to Canada in 1847 is the most appalling sea journey possible. The ships sailing between Canada and Britain are very shoddily built. Many of them are unseaworthy. And fever comes on board the ships, and fever is carried across the Atlantic. 1 in 5 of everyone who boards one of these, what become known as coffin ships, to Canada in 1847, die on the journey.
They then took to the coffin ships going across the Atlantic. And there was many dying overboard, dumped overboard. There was a man and a wife and 2 kids on one of the coffin ships, and one of the kids died, and she was weeping and wailing. She didn't want to part with it. So the captain snatched it off to her hand and dumped it overboard. And she jumped into the sea after it. The weeping mother abandoned ship to where her child had gone. The dry-eyed captain smoked his pipe, and the sailing ship sailed on.
The coffin ships were few in number, but they would become the famine's most enduring story. By chartering the Virginius, Mahon entered that story. While his ship lay docked in Quebec, rumors raced through Strokestown. The ship, it was said, had been lost at sea, gone down with all on board. Strokestown that summer was a fertile place for rumors. Times were strange. Nothing was so strange as to be beyond belief. That was no accident, some whispered. Not at all. The Major wanted it that way. Wanted that ship to go down. Late that summer, Dennis Mahon wrote to his agent, "Please have the gunmaker send my mahogany case containing my 6-barrel pistol."
He had a number of meetings in Roscommon. He had visited the sheriff's office with a view to further evictions from his estate. He was travelling back to Strokestown, and the assassins were concealed underneath this bridge on the road, waiting for them to come. And as soon as the carriage came to within them, they came out from behind the ditches and fired at the Major, and one of them hit him with the shot in the chest. It was carefully planned by the secret societies at the time. As news was spread by word of mouth, you could only describe it amongst the peasant farmers and the tenants as they were jubilant. Jubilant, because he was a figure of hate like most landlords at the time.
The man who was hanged for the murder of Mahon was Patrick Hasty, confessed member of the Molly Maguires. At his funeral, the streets of Strokestown were choked with crowds come in from the countryside to celebrate a champion. Major Mahon was buried in the family chapel with few public expressions of grief. His daughter and heir was not present. She went into exile, never to return.
The murder of Major Mahon in November 1847 is very widely reported in the British press. It becomes a great cause célèbre. It's discussed everywhere. It goes right up into the British government. So there's tremendous debate within British society about how to respond to this. But the overall impact, I think, definitely is to add to the perception that the Irish are violent, barbarous people, and sympathy with them is misplaced and should not be continued.
This was a few hundred miles away from Ireland, where the economic powerhouse of the world was. And the British government had the power and they had the money to try and salvage the situation, and they did virtually nothing, in fact. And so this was the final catastrophe, really.
In 1847, Parliament enacted a new poor law. Legislation so punishing that future generations would believe the famine was a British plot. The truth was more ordinary than that. The British government, weak, divided, fearful of a taxpayer revolt, dumped the entire cost of relief into the lap of the Irish landlords. Not to be outdone, Irish landlords won new rights to clear the poor from their estates. It fell to utopians like Trevelyan to dress up this brutal compromise. Irish property, he said, would at last be responsible for Irish poverty. The law would work wonders on Ireland's leisure classes, the idle poor at the bottom of the barrel, and the idle rich at the top.
Early in 47, Lord Sligo shut down Westport House, claiming that he couldn't afford to maintain it anymore, and moved into a much smaller house on James Street in Westport Town with his two spinster sisters and with his widowed mother there a good part of the time as well. He became essentially a resident of the town, in that there would be no way to shelter yourself from the destitution that was all around you. The sense we get is that Lord Sligo was right at the center of local relief efforts living in Westport Town.
From his new home on Westport's crowded streets, Lord Sligo badgered his government. In letter after letter, he brought the sufferings of his tenants before the eyes of Dublin and London.
He felt it was his duty and his job to protest. Many of these protestations really fell on deaf ears. Their attitude was that you're over there, you're the landlord, you have to work out your own problems.
Lord Sligo had paid the lion's share of the cost to bring cornmeal in from New Orleans. He had paid the relief committee's debts rather than see it shut down. His financial situation went from bad to worse. The new poor law threatened to bankrupt him.
The Poor Law Extension Act of 1847, which turned the full financial responsibility for famine relief over to the local taxpayers, essentially, which in the west of Ireland meant the landlords, because they had the responsibility for paying the taxes of their poorest tenants, and in the case of the Marquess of Sligo, that's just about everybody. The numbers of people needing relief is growing dramatically. The other thing that you see is that the attempt to collect the rates which would pay for that relief effort are falling flat. You see those columns in the relief books of attempts to collect the rates, and it's 0, 0, 0, 0.
The Poor Law of 1847 added new terrors to the ordeal of starvation by designating the workhouses as the centers of relief. The Irish detested the workhouse, where children were separated from parents and parents from one another, where the work was the breaking of stones. But as the famine wore on, the increasingly desperate Irish clamored for entry, if only as a place to die.
People have to go to the workhouse, and those are the worst conditions under which fevers can spread. Workhouses become just contagion centers.
You would find people lying shoulder to shoulder in beds in very close contact, touching each other, some with cholera, many with fever. And if you plan to destroy that part of the population, you couldn't possibly find a better method of doing it.
People were very reluctant to have recourse to the workhouses. The sense of degradation which emanated from the very walls of places like this would have been really suffocating.
You would see bodies side by side, some of them dead, some of them living, some of them delirious. And when they were admitted, they were pointed to a place on the floor, probably vacated recently by a dead body, and they lay down there to take their turn at dying.
1 million destitute found places in Ireland's workhouses in a single year. Soup depots were set up to handle 1 million more, crowding outside. But the new law refused relief to any small holder of land. As little as 1/4 of an acre in property made them ineligible. The hungry faced a cruel choice. They could give up their land and home to get relief, or keep their home and starve. The quarter-acre clause cut through the Irish countryside like a scythe. Those who chose food were pushed off the land. their cabins pulled down over their heads. Some saved what they could from the wreckage to build lean-tos for themselves in the ditches of the roads. By the spring of 1848, Lord Sligo had been stripped of his post as chairman of local relief at Westport and was being sued to pay up his arrears. Still, he held out, one of the few landlords in Mayo who refused to evict.
We didn't go in for enormous evictions. We went an eviction family. I mean, this was our home. This was our development. This was our estate. The people that were on the estate at the time, whether they worked here or whether they were tenants, were our own people and our own countrymen and women, in fact.
By early 1848, Lord Sligo is deeply in debt. He owes back taxes to the Poor Law Union of about £2,000, and he's also paying the taxes on 75–85% of his tenant farmers. And so he finds himself, like many West of Ireland landlords, at least in his own calculation, with no alternative but to clear the estate of these pauper tenants for whom he is paying taxes. And to begin, I think, to see the opportunities that this enormous tragedy provided landlords like himself to make some rational calculations about the estate. My guess is that on the Sligo estate, 6,000 to 10,000 people were evicted over the course of 3 or 4 years from 48 on.
Lord Sligo cleared about 1/4 of his tenants, those most in arrears. He defended himself in a long and anguished letter to his cousin. "If you go bankrupt," Sligo argued, "your estate will be seized and all your tenants will be evicted. It is the indulgent landlord who is the real exterminator." The famine and poor law forced hard choices. Lord Sligo, for years the champion of his tenants, now turned them out on the roads.
He doesn't say, here's 75 shillings, get yourself a boat off to America. They're, as far as we can tell, just turned loose and just disappear. Mayo in 4950 would have been a scene of horror, of people on the roadside, bodies on the roadside, people living wherever they could find even the minimal amount of shelter. The obvious thing to do when you're evicted is to go to the workhouse. Now, the workhouses are all full, and so people just vanish into the countryside and die.
This is the workhouse graveyard attached to the old Ennistimon workhouse, which was just down there over the hill. And here in 2 pits you can see where hundreds of people, maybe even thousands, were buried during 1851, 52 and possibly 53. And all around us here as well you can see the little depressions where burials are made at a later stage. There are no headstones except for one down here which is much, much later. And they were brought here to the graveyard, coffins laid in tiers on top of each other with a very loose covering of earth until they had filled up the pits completely. And as you can see, over the years then the soil has subsided as the bodies decayed. And it's a very telling reminder of what happened here during the famine.
During the last throes of the famine, the British government argued fruitlessly over policy, but made few changes. The mass suffering was widely reported, but for reformers and landowners alike, it was the price that would have to be paid for Ireland's regeneration. The fungus returned in 1848 and 1849, and with their cabins and their society tumbling around them, the Irish fought to survive. Old solidarities dissolved. Farmers dug traps in their fields to impale anyone who trespassed.
My grandfather in Innisfree Island told me as a child that the family had enough food during the famine. They had more than enough. They used to share it with their neighbours. But in the end, it got down to them using the food to survive themselves versus giving it away to the neighbours. And when some of the neighbours died, my great-grandmother felt guilty that they lived while others died. And all her life she mourned about the loss of the neighbours and how she could not have saved them. All her life. Gaelic society broke down entirely, not only with neighbour, not helping neighbour, but within families. Not all over, but there were individuals, families that experienced this. The father disappearing, couldn't cope with it anymore, couldn't see his kids die, and just walked away and never came back.
You've got vast numbers of people moving around the country. You've got the depopulation of entire villages and entire districts, people fleeing from the land, hoping to get away to the emigration ports. There's masses of people on the roads, hoping desperately to get away, many of them failing to get away, many of them dying on the roadside.
Many of the famine survivors who had hoarded their passage money and fought their way to the ports knew that their deliverance had come at the expense of kinfolk and neighbors. To survive, they had to unlearn the communal codes they'd been reared on. Before them lay the Atlantic crossing, but they already lived in a new world. 1.5 million of them got out, more than during the previous 200 years.
Thousands upon thousands of people, many of them my relatives, left these glens and valleys to go out to the United States, fleeing from hunger and disease. When I stand here, I can see 500 years of my family's history. Out here, the McSweeneys had a castle. They were chieftains and they were driven out of there and eventually came in here. The Campbells came in with them and they spread out across this landscape. Other branches of my family, the Gallaghers, the Boyles, the O'Donnells, the Dohertys, all lived in these glens and stayed there until 1840s when, as a result of the Great Hunger, they moved out of these glens in droves and went out to Pennsylvania, to Boston, to New Jersey and to New York and all across the United States.
My family comes to the United States because of the famine. And for the next 50 or 60 years, members of my family will be bringing out other members of the family. The communities that will be established around the world that the Irish will go to will be created by the famine Irish. There will be the molding experience for generations of immigrants to come. They'll all be touched to one extent or another by the experience of the famine.
The Irish who left the West empty, and its Gaelic singers and storytellers silent, brought the makings of a news story with them to America. The Irish, so the story goes, had been starved out of their country, driven into exile. But they were a chosen people, destined one day to take their rightful place among the peoples of the earth. On that story, told and retold, the Irish would build for themselves a new communal life. A new Ireland would emerge in America, with new songs to sing.
Major funding for this program was provided by Jefferson Smurfit Corporation. Around the world, we're known for our paper, paperboard and packaging products, and paper recycling. We are proud of our Irish heritage through our association with Jefferson Smurfit Group.
Funding for this program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
This is PBS.